According to Horace, the poet who first tried his skill in tragic verse for the paltry prize of a goat, soon after exposed to view wild satyrs naked, and attempted raillery with severity, still preserving the gravity of tragedy. Yeah, tragedy. So that's what I've been banging on mostly about. What does the actual word mean? Like all of these kind of words, it comes from ancient Greece. And in this case, we're talking about, it's generally given as tragos and oida, or oidos. So it kind of becomes tragoida, which becomes tragedy. According to Aristotle, according to words, it kind of means goat song, like ode. That word we have, it comes from the Greek comes from the Greek oida, which is kind of song, and tragos being goat. In Aristotle, he's referring to the satyr chorus that he seemed to think that all the plays kind of initially had. Now, the satyrs do show up. They're kind of like the bottom half of a goat and the top half of a man, Pan, if you will. And they do show up quite a bit in the tragedies, but mostly in the satyr plays, which are sort of like a palate cleanser between a couple of the tragedies. Normally for the tragedy festivals, they'd have to write three tragedies and a satyr play to compose a full festival. It was a full day at the theatre. And the satyr chorus was, obviously going to be probably the chorus that was in the other ones as well, but this time wearing goatskin trousers in order to make it look like they are satyrs. But they don't really show up in the actual tragedies themselves, as far as we know. Perhaps it was standard for them to have these goat legs. I'm not an expert. But I've tended to go a little bit more along the lines of the Alexandrian approach. The Alexandrians kind of took the Horace's attitude from, and that quote comes from Ars Poetica. Horace's attitude, that Alexandrian approach was that the plays were the song of the goat, and that the prize was the goat. The sacrifice of a goat in order for the good of the people previously gets replaced by the praying to God in the form of the play. That's tended to be my take on it, and it sort of fits nicely with the idea of the scapegoat, that we put all our evils into this one goat and we sacrifice it. This one goat sometimes is Oedipus, sometimes is Medea, sometimes is whoever. All our ills, as I'm going to get to that later, get emplaced within this one creature, this one unfortunate. However, in 1922, I'd never heard this before. I don't know that I necessarily agree, but I kind of like it. Jane Ellen Harrison pointed out that Dionysus, who was the god of wine, as we understand, had been previously the god of beer, the working person's drink. Wine would be the drink of the wealthier classes because it takes longer to ferment, whereas beer, you can get that quickly enough. So there's nothing to say in my mind that Dionysus, as god of beer and wine, is the same god, but however. Either way, beer in the time of ancient Greece is probably taken from the fermentation of barley, which, by the way, in Greek is tragos. So it's likely that the term had been, odes to beer, or, beerly. What she says is, tragedy, I believe, to be not the goat song, but the harvest song of the cereal tragos, the form of spelt known as the goat. Now, I like this more than I might necessarily believe it. A harvest song, it's the wrong time of year. Those festivals, particularly to Dionysus, tended to be in the spring, or the later part of the spring, rather than in the autumn. So, arguably, could you have got a fresh beer together after harvest just in time for the festival? Maybe. Beer experts, write in and tell me. The key thing to understanding tragedy in these festivals is seeing what place they had in society. Now, in a real sense, they were there as a religious festival. We tell the stories of our gods, we tell the stories of our history. And we get both sides with Aeschylus, who tells of stories from the Trojan War, and he also tells stories about the battle with the Persians. Its main purpose was sort of a uniting moment and a celebration. Now, we get to Aristotle, and every time I say that, I feel like, yeah, they all know I'm a skeptic. We get to Aristotle. Aristotle did amazing things in terms of outlining Greek theatre. He's a very ordered man, and things have to be in the right place, and there has to be a reason for everything. Now, again, as I've said before, we don't trust Aristotle because he thought that worms couldn't reproduce, and that women were essentially monsters. So I find a lot of his work, what he tends to do is he starts from this is what we have, and then tries to reverse engineer a reason for it, when oftentimes the reason is, well, this is how we could make that thing work. He looked at the Greek theatre as being a socially important valve, a safety valve, if you like, for what needed to happen. He spoke a lot about catharsis. Now, the difference between the catharsis we know and the catharsis in Greek is, number one, catharsis in the Greek was spelled in Greek letters. It's not that it's a K. And number two, that he saw it as being a social good. So this catharsis, pronounced the same as we pronounce the version we have today, was there to help people. He saw that tragedies had a social function, and that social function was an opportunity to examine the pity and fear and the dark, deep emotions in people. And these plays, arousing those emotions, had a sort of a purgative effect. It brought these emotions that were struggling with all week, all year, and brings them to the surface and allow them to sort of cleanse out of us. Ultimately, he feels that an audience should actually feel good after seeing a tragedy. And if you see a good one, yes, you will. I think his quote in Poetics is, if I've got this right, tragedy is therefore an imitation of a noble and complete action, which through compassion and fear produces perfect purification of the passions. So to break that down to a bit, imitation, mimesis, it's such a big word. We use it all the time in talking about theatre, but we actually don't really use it when we talk about watching theatre. Mimesis, the idea that we're imitating, that we're copying, that we're reflecting an action, an activity. Again, tragedy is therefore an imitation of a noble and complete action. He felt that these tragedies had to be complete stories within one. Tell that to the Oresteia. A tragedy being an imitation of the action that we all participate in as spectators. I'm a big believer that as spectators, as an audience, we are an active part of a play. We change it imperceptibly in our reactions and in our breathing. I know that's an odd one to say. How we breathe changes a performance. If we, as a group, become part of a joint breath, where we are kind of reacting and being as a single body, that influences a performance immensely. And Aristotle, who I always give out about, bought into this. Aristotle felt strongly that we work as a mass together. Otherwise, how can this purgation, this purification of the passions work? We see these horrible things, and it brings them to the surface, and we vomit them out. So with something like Medea, that would be a very cathartic experience. where you feel these, maybe you feel negatively towards your wife because, she overdid the broccoli, or maybe she gave out to you for not coming home when you were meant to come home, when you promised her you would be home on time, or any of these things that don't actually happen in my life. You feel negative feelings towards your wife, or in general, and you see this woman, or you feel, as she doesn't do on stage, her kill her children in a revenge act, you might go, wow, isn't life great that I don't do that? That's the ecstasis side of things. Now, ecstasis, according to Plotinus, is the culmination of human possibility. Now, for Aristotle, it's slightly different in that it's sort of the casting down of a thing from its proper state or place. But in reality, the effect tied to the purgation is an effect of somebody who is basically exuding or exhaling these bad feelings. Now, again, with Aristotle, you can always know Aristotle's right because he's proven wrong by so many examples. I feel you don't get that same cathartic sense that I think he talks of in something like Oedipus at Colonus or the Eumenides, where at the end there is possibly, I won't say a happy ending, but an ending of hope. At the end of Oedipus at Colonus, he practically ascends from this mortal coil. It's sad, but there is some positive to it too. At the end of the Eumenides, he gets away with it. I mean, did he really deserve to be executed? Well, did he have the right to be the judge and jury? You can argue either way, but that creation of a court to try him and remove him from the eternal blood feud, it changes the nature. Being finally grabbed by the Eumenides would be a lot more cathartic than him having to go through a trial. Catharsis, you'll definitely get an Oedipus Tyrannos. One dies, another gouges eye out. And more than anything, more than these token acts at the end of the tragedy, the cathartic feeling is the combination of knowing what's destined and that it's inescapable, and also having to go through it too. For me, that is the most pure catharsis in ancient Greek theatre.